An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Part 1. Unmerciful Disaster. In the morning after breakfast it was decided that the men should begin to dig a sloping bed which would allow the Halbrane to slide to the foot of the iceberg. Would that Heaven might grant success to the operation, for who could contemplate without terror having to brave the severity of the austral winter, and to pass 6 months under such conditions as ours on a vast iceberg, dragged none could tell whither. Once the winter had set in, none of us could have escaped from that most terrible of fates, dying of cold. At this moment Dirk Peters, who was observing the horizon from south to east at about 100 paces off, cried in a rough voice, "Lying to!" Lying to? What could the half-breed mean by that, except that the floating mass had suddenly ceased to drift? As for the cause of this stoppage, it was neither the moment to investigate it, nor to ask ourselves what the consequences were likely to be. "It is true, however," cried the boatswain, "the iceberg is not stirring, and perhaps has not stirred since it capsized." "How?" said I. "It no longer changes its place?" "No," replied the mate, "and the proof is that the others, drifting on, are leaving it behind." And in fact, whilst 5 or 6 icebergs were descending towards the south, ours was as motionless as though it had been stranded on a shoal. The simplest explanation was that the new base had encountered ground at the bottom of the sea to which it now adhered, and would continue to adhere unless the submerged part rose in the water so as to cause a second capsize. This complicated matters seriously, because the dangers of positive immobility were such that the chances of drifting were preferable. At least in the latter case there was some hope of coming across a continent or an island, or even, if the currents did not change, of crossing the boundaries of the austral region. Here we were, then, after 3 months of this terrible voyage. Was there now any question of trying to save William Guy, his comrades on the Jane, and Arthur Pym? Was it not for our own safety that any means at our disposal should be employed? And could it be wondered at were the sailors of the Halbrane to rebel? Were they to listen to Hearne's suggestion, and make their officers, or myself especially, responsible for the disasters of this expedition? Moreover, was it likely to take place, since, notwithstanding their losses, the followers of the sealing master were still a majority of the ship's company? The question, I could clearly see, was occupying the thoughts of Captain Len Guy and West. Again, although the recruits from the Falklands formed only a total of 14 men, as against the 12 of the old crew, was it not to be feared that some of the latter would take Hearne's side? What if Hearne's people, urged by despair, were already thinking of seizing the only boat we now possessed, setting off towards the north, and leaving us on this iceberg? It was then of great importance that our boat should be put in safety and closely watched. A marked change had taken place in Captain Len Guy since the recent occurrences. He seemed to be transformed upon finding himself face to face with the dangers which menaced us. Up to that time he had been solely occupied in searching for his fellow countrymen. He had handed over the command of the schooner to West, and he could not have given it to anyone more zealous and more capable. But from this date he resumed his position as master of the ship, and used it with the energy required by the circumstances. In a word, he again became sole master on board, after God. At his command the crew were drawn up around him on a flat spot a little to the left of the Halbrane. In that place the following were assembled: on the seniors' side, Martin, Holt, and Hardy; Rogers, Francis, Gratian, Bury, Stern, the cook, Endicott, and I may add Dirk Peters; on the side of the newcomers, Hearne and the 13 other Falkland sailors. The latter composed a distinct group. The sealing master was their spokesman, and exercised a baneful influence over them. Captain Len Guy cast a stern glance upon the men, and said in a sharp tone, "Sailors of the Halbrane, I must first speak to you of our lost companions. 5 of us have just perished in this catastrophe." "We are waiting to perish in our turn in these seas, where we have been dragged in spite of—" "Be silent, Hearne!" cried West, pale with anger. "Or if not—" "Hearne has said what he had to say," Captain Len Guy continued coldly. "Now it is said, and I advise him not to interrupt me a second time." The sealing master might possibly have ventured on an answer, for he felt that he was backed by the majority of the crew, but Martin Holt held him back, and he was silent. Captain Len Guy then took off his hat and pronounced the following words with an emotion that affected us to the bottom of our hearts: "We must pray for those who have died in this dangerous voyage, which was undertaken in the name of humanity. May God be pleased to take into consideration the fact that they devoted their lives to their fellow creatures, and may He not be insensible to our prayers. Kneel down, sailors of the Halbrane." They all knelt down on the icy surface, and the murmurs of prayers ascended towards heaven. We waited for Captain Len Guy to rise before we did so. "Now," he resumed, "after those who are dead come those who have survived. To them I say that they must obey me, whatever my orders may be, and even in our present situation I shall not tolerate any hesitation or opposition. The responsibility for the general safety is mine, and I will not yield any of it to anyone. I am master here, as on board." "On board when there is no longer a ship," muttered the sealing master. "You are mistaken, Hearne. The vessel is there, and we will put it back into the sea. Besides, if we had only a boat, I am the captain of it. Let him beware who forgets this." That day Captain Len Guy, having taken the height of the sun by the sextant, and fixed the hour by the chronometer, both of these instruments had escaped destruction in the collision, obtained the following position of his ship: South latitude 88° 55', west longitude 39° 12'. The Halbrane was only at 1° 5', about 65 miles from the South Pole. "All hands to work," was the captain's order that afternoon, and every one obeyed it with a will. There was not a moment to lose, as the question of time was more important than any other. So far as provisions were concerned, there was enough in the schooner for 18 months on full rations, so we were not threatened with hunger, nor with thirst either, notwithstanding that, owing to water casks having been burst in the collision, their contents had escaped through their staves. Luckily the barrels of gin, whisky, beer, and wine, being placed in the least exposed part of the hold, were nearly all intact. Under this head we had experienced no loss, and the iceberg would supply us with good drinking water. It is a well known fact that ice, whether formed from fresh or salt water, contains no salt, owing to the chloride of sodium being eliminated in the change from liquid to the solid state. The origin of the ice, therefore, is a matter of no importance. However, those blocks which are easily distinguished by their green colour and their perfect transparency are preferable. They are solidified rain, and therefore much more suitable for drinking water. Without doubt our captain would have recognized any blocks of this description, but none were to be found on the glacier, owing to its being that part of the berg which was originally submerged and came to the top after the fall. The captain and West decided first to lighten the vessel by conveying everything on board to land. The masts were to be cleared of rigging, taken out, and placed on the plateau. It was necessary to lighten the vessel as much as possible, even to clear out the ballast, owing to the difficult and dangerous operation of launching. It would be better to put off our departure for some days if this operation could be performed under more favourable circumstances. The loading might afterwards be accomplished without much difficulty. Besides this, another reason, by no means less serious, presented itself to us. It would have been an act of unpardonable rashness to leave the provisions in the storeroom of the Halbrane, her situation on the side of the iceberg being very precarious. One shake would suffice to detach the ship, and with her would have disappeared the supplies on which our lives depended. On this account we passed the day in removing casks of half salted meat, dried vegetables, flour, biscuits, tea, coffee, barrels of gin, whisky, wine and beer from the hold and storeroom, and placing them safely in the hammocks near the Halbrane. We also had to ensure our landing against any possible accident, and, I must add, against any plot on the part of Hearne and others to seize the boat in order to return to the ice barrier. We placed the long boat in a cavity which would be easy to watch, about 30 feet to the left of the schooner, along with its oars, rudder, compass, anchor, masts, and sail. By day there was nothing to fear, and at night, or rather during the hours of sleep, the boatswain and one of the superiors would keep guard near the cavity, and we might rest assured that no evil could befall. The 19th, 20th, and 21st of January were passed in working extra hard in the unshipping of the cargo, and the dismantling of the Halbrane. We slung the lower mast by means of yards forming props. Later on, West would see to replacing the main and the mizzen masts. In any case, we could do without them until we had reached the Falklands or some other winter port. Needless to say, we had set up a camp on the plateau of which I have spoken, not far from the Halbrane. Sufficient shelter against the inclemency of weather, not unfrequent at this time of the year, was to be found under tents, constructed of sails placed on spars and fastened down by pegs. The glass remained set fair. The wind was northeast, the temperature having risen to 46 degrees (2.78 degrees Celsius). Endicott's kitchen was fitted up at the end of the plain, near a steep projection by which we could climb to the very top of the berg. It is only fair to state that during these 3 days of hard work no fault was to be found with Hearne. The sealing master knew he was being closely watched, and he was well aware that Captain Len Guy would not spare him if he tried to get up insubordination amongst his comrades. It was a pity that his bad instincts had induced him to play such a part, for his strength, skill, and cleverness made him a very valuable man, and he had never proved more useful than under these circumstances. Was he changed for the better? Did he understand that the general good feeling was necessary for the safety of all? I know not, but I had no confidence in him, neither had Hurliguerly. I need not dwell on the ardour with which the half breed did the rough work, always first to begin and the last to leave off, doing as much as 4 men, and scarcely sleeping, only resting during meals, which he took apart from the others. He had hardly spoken to me at all since the schooner had met with this terrible accident. What indeed could he say to me? Did I not know as well as he that it would be necessary to renounce every hope of pursuing our intended voyage? Now and again I noticed Martin Holt and the half breed near each other while some difficult piece of work was in progress. Our sailing master did not miss a chance of getting near Dirk Peters, who always tried his best to escape from him, for reasons well known to me. And whenever I thought of the secret of the fate of the so called Parker, Martin Holt's brother, which had been entrusted to me, that dreadful scene of the Grampus filled me with horror. I was certain that if this secret were made known, the half breed would become an object of terror. He would no longer be looked upon as the rescuer of the sailing master, and the latter, learning that his brother, luckily Dirk Peters and myself were the only two acquainted with the fact. While the Halbrane was being unloaded, Captain Len Guy and the mate were considering how the vessel might be launched. They had to allow for a drop of 100 feet between the cavity in which the ship lay and the sea, this to be effected by means of an inclined bed hollowed in an oblique line along the west side of the iceberg, and to measure 200 or 300 perches in length. So, while the first lot of men, commanded by the boatswain, was unloading the schooner, a second batch, under West's orders, began to cut the trench between the blocks which covered the side of the floating mountain. Floating, I know not why I use this expression, for the iceberg no longer floated, but remained as motionless as an island. There was nothing to indicate that it would ever move again. Other icebergs drifted along and passed us, going southeast, whilst ours, to use Dirk Peters' expression, was lying to. Would its base be sufficiently undermined to allow it to detach itself? Perhaps some heavy mass of ice might strike it and set it free by the shock. No one could predict such an event, and we had only the Halbrane to rely upon for getting us out of these regions. We were engaged in these various tasks until the 24th of January. The atmosphere was clear, the temperature was even, and the thermometer had indeed gone up 2 or 3 degrees above freezing point. The number of icebergs coming from the northwest was therefore increasing. There were now 100 of them, and a collision with any of these might have a most disastrous result. Hardy, the caulker, hastened first of all to mend the hull. Pegs had to be changed, bits of planking to be replaced, seams to be caulked. We had everything that was necessary for this work, and we might rest assured that it would be performed in the best possible manner. In the midst of the silence of these solitudes, the noise of the hammers striking the nails into the side, and the sound of the mallet stuffing tow into the seams, had a startling effect. Sea gulls, wild ducks, albatross, and petrels flew in a circle round the top of the berg, with a shrill screaming, and made a terrible uproar. When I found myself with West and the captain, our conversation naturally turned on our situation and An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 20, Part 2. Unmerciful Disaster. One day, as we were seated on the summit of the iceberg, gazing fixedly on the deceptive horizon, he exclaimed, "Who could ever have imagined, Mr. Joerling, when the Halbrane left Kerguelen, that 6½ months afterwards she would be stuck on the side of an ice mountain?" "A fact much more to be regretted," I replied, because only for that accident we should have attained our object, and we should have begun our return journey." "I didn't mean to contradict," replied the boatswain. "But you say we should have attained our object. Do you mean by that that we should have found our countrymen?" "Perhaps." "I can scarcely believe such would have been the case, Mr. Jeorling, although this was the principal and perhaps even the only object of our navigation in the polar seas." "The only one, yes, at the start," I insinuated. "But since the half breed's revelations about Arthur Pym—" "Ah, you are always harking back on that subject, like brave Dirk Peters." "Always, Hurliguerly, and only that a deplorable and unforeseen accident made us run aground." "I leave you to your delusions, Mr. Jeorling, since you believe you have run aground. Why, is not this the case?" "In any case, it is a wonderful running aground," replied the boatswain. "Instead of a good solid bottom, we have run aground in the air." "Then I am right, Hurliguerly, in saying that it is an unfortunate adventure." "Unfortunate, truly, but in my opinion we should take warning by it." "What warning?" "That it is not permitted for us to venture so far in these latitudes, and I believe that the Creator forbids his creatures to climb to the summit of the poles." "Notwithstanding that the summit of one pole is only 60 miles away from us now." "Granted, Mr. Jeorling, but these 60 miles are equal to thousands when we have no means of making them. And if the launch of the schooner is not successful, here we are, condemned to winter quarters which the polar bears themselves would hardly relish." I replied only by a shake of my head, which Hurliguerly could not fail to understand. "Do you know, Mr. Jeorling, of what I think oftenest?" "What do you think of, boatswain?" "Of the Kerguelens, whither we are certainly not travelling. Truly, in a bad season it was cold enough there. There is not much difference between this archipelago and the islands situated on the edge of the Antarctic Sea. But there one is not far from the Cape, and if we want to warm our shins, no iceberg bars the way. Whereas here it is the devil to weigh anchor, and one never knows if one shall find a clear course." "I repeat it, boatswain, if this last accident had not occurred, everything would have been over by this time, one way or another. We should still have had more than 6 weeks to get out of these southern seas. It is seldom that a ship is so roughly treated as ours has been, and I consider it real bad luck after our having profited by such fortunate circumstances." "These circumstances are all over, Mr. Jeorling," exclaimed Hurliguerly, "and I fear indeed—" "What, you also, boatswain? You, whom I believed to be so confident?" "Confidence, Mr. Jeorling, wears out like the ends of one's trousers. What would you have me do? When I compare my lot to old Atkins, installed in his cosy inn, when I think of the Green Cormorant, of the big parlours downstairs, with the little tables round which friends sip whisky and gin, discussing the news of the day, while the stove makes more noise than the weathercock on the roof, oh, then the comparison is not in our favour, and in my opinion Mr. Atkins enjoys life better than I do." "You shall see them all again, boatswain, Atkins, the Green Cormorant, and the Kerguelen. For God's sake, do not let yourself grow downhearted, and if you, a sensible and courageous man, despair already—" "Oh, if I were the only one it would not be half so bad as it is." "The whole crew does not despair, surely?" "Yes and no," replied Hurliguerly, "for I know some who are not at all satisfied." "Has Hearne begun his mischief again? Is he exciting his companion?" "Not openly, at least, Mr. Jeorling, and since I have kept him under my eye, I have neither seen nor heard anything. Besides, he knows what awaits him if he budges. I believe I am not mistaken, the sly dog has changed his tactics. But what does not astonish me in him, astonishes me in Martin Holt." "What do you mean, boatswain?" "That they seem to be on good terms with each other. See how Hearne seeks out Martin Holt, talks to him frequently, and Holt does not treat his overtures unfavourably. Martin Holt is not one of those who would listen to Hearne's advice, or follow it if he tried to provoke rebellion amongst the crew." "No doubt, Mr. Jeorling. However, I don't fancy seeing them so much together. Hearne is a dangerous and unscrupulous individual, and most likely Martin Holt does not distrust him sufficiently." "He is wrong, boatswain." "And wait a moment. Do you know what they were talking about the other day when I overheard a few scraps of their conversation?" "I could not possibly guess until you tell me, Hurliguerly." "Well, while they were conversing on the bridge of the Halbrane, I heard them talking about Dirk Peters, and Hearne was saying, 'You must not owe a grudge to the half breed, Master Holt, because he refused to respond to your advances and accept your thanks. If he be only a sort of brute, he possesses plenty of courage, and has shown it in getting you out of a bad corner at the risk of his life. And besides, do not forget that he formed part of the crew of the Grampus, and your brother Ned, if I don't mistake." "He said that, boatswain? He spoke of the Grampus?" I exclaimed. "Yes, of the Grampus." "And of Ned Holt?" "Precisely, Mr. Jeorling." "And what answer did Martin Holt make?" "He replied, 'I don't even know under what circumstances my unfortunate brother perished. Was it during a revolt on board? Brave man that he was, he would not betray his captain, and perhaps he was massacred.'" "Did Hearne dwell on this, boatswain?" "Yes, but he added, 'It is very sad for you, Master Holt. The captain of the Grampus, according to what I have been told, was abandoned, being placed in a small boat with one or two of his men, and who knows if your brother was not along with them?'" "And what next?" "Then, Mr. Jeorling," he added, "did it never occur to you to ask Dirk Peters to enlighten you on the subject?" "Yes, once," replied Martin Holt. "I questioned the half breed about it, and never did I see a man so overcome. He replied in so low a voice that I could scarcely understand him, 'I know not, I know not.' And he ran away with his face buried in his hands." "Was that all you heard of the conversation, boatswain?" "That was all, Mr. Jeorling, and I thought it so strange that I wished to inform you of it." "And what conclusion did you draw from it?" "Nothing, except that I look upon the sealing master as a scoundrel of deepest dye, perfectly capable of working in secret for some evil purpose with which he would like to associate Martin Holt." What did Hearne's new attitude mean? Why did he strive to gain Martin Holt, one of the best of the crew, as an ally? Why did he recall the scenes of the Grampus? Did Hearne know more of this matter of Dirk Peters and Ned Holt than the others, this secret which the half breed and I believed ourselves to be the sole possessors? The doubt caused me serious uneasiness. However, I took care not to say anything of it to Dirk Peters. If he had for a moment suspected that Hearne spoke of what happened on board the Grampus, if he had heard that the rascal, as Hurliguerly called him, and not without reason, constantly talked to Martin Holt about his brother, I really do not know what would have happened. In short, whatever the intentions of Hearne might be, it was dreadful to think that our sailing master, on whose fidelity Captain Len Guy ought to be able to count, was in conspiracy with him. The sealing master must have a strong motive for acting in this way. What it was I could not imagine. Although the crew seemed to have abandoned every thought of mutiny, a strict watch was kept, especially on Hearne. Besides, the situation must soon change, at least so far as the schooner was concerned. 2 days afterwards the work was finished. The caulking operations were completed, and also the slide for lowering the vessel to the base of our floating mountain. Just now the upper portion of the ice had been slightly softened, so that this last work did not entail much labour for pickaxe or spade. The course ran obliquely round the west side of the berg, so that the incline should not be too great at any point. With cables properly fixed, the launch, it seemed, might be effected without any mishap. I rather feared lest the melting of the ice should make the gliding less smooth at the lower part of the berg. Needless to say, the cargo, masting, anchors, chains, etc., had not been put on board. The hull was quite heavy enough, and not easily moved, so it was necessary to lighten it as much as possible. When the schooner was again in its element, the loading could be effected in a few days. On the afternoon of the 28th, the finishing touches were given. It was necessary to put supports for the sides of the slide in some places where the ice had melted quickly. Then every one was allowed to rest from 4 p.m. The captain had double rations served out to all hands, and well they merited this extra supply of spirits. They had indeed worked hard during the week. I repeated that every sign of mutiny had disappeared. The crew thought of nothing except this great operation of the launching. The Halbrane in the sea would mean departure. It would also mean return. For Dirk Peters and me it would be the definite abandonment of Arthur Pym. That night the temperature was at the highest we had so far experienced. The thermometer registered 53 degrees, 11.67 degrees Celsius above zero. So, although the sun was nearing the horizon, the ice was melting, and thousands of small streams flowed in every direction. The early birds woke at 4 o'clock, and I was one of their number. I had scarcely slept, and I fancy that Dirk Peters did not sleep much, haunted as he was by the sad thought of having to turn back. The launch was to take place at 10 o'clock. Taking every possible difficulty into account, and allowing for the minutest precautions, the captain hoped that it would be completed before the close of the day. Every one believed that by evening the schooner would be at the foot of the berg. Of course we all had to lend a hand to this difficult task. To each man a special duty was assigned. Some were employed to facilitate the sliding with wooden rollers if necessary, others to moderate the speed of the hull in case it became too great, by means of hawsers and cables. We breakfasted at 9 o'clock in the tents. Our sailors were perfectly confident, and could not refrain from drinking success to the event. And although this was a little premature, we added our hurrahs to theirs. Success seemed very nearly assured, as the captain and the mate had worked out the matter so carefully and skilfully. At last we were about to leave our encampment and take up our stations. Some of the sailors were there already, when cries of amazement and fear were raised. What a frightful scene, and short as it may have been, what an impression of terror it left on our minds! One of the enormous blocks which formed the bank of the mud bed where the Halbrane lay, having become loose owing to the melting of its base, had slipped and was bounding over the others down the incline. In another moment the schooner, being no longer retained in position, was swinging on this declivity. On board, on deck, in front, there were two sailors, Rogers and Gratian. In vain did the unfortunate men try to jump over the bulwarks. They had not time, and they were dragged away in this dreadful fall. Yes, I saw it. I saw the schooner topple over, slide down first on its right side, crush one of the men who delayed too long about jumping to one side, then bound from block to block, and finally fling itself into space. In another moment the Halbrane staved in, broken up, with gaping planks and shattered ribs, had sunk, causing a tremendous jet of water to spout up at the foot of the iceberg. Horrified, yes, indeed we were horrified when the schooner, carried off as though by an avalanche, had disappeared in the abyss. Not a particle of our Halbrane remained, not even a wreck. A minute ago she was 100 feet in the air, now she was 500 in the depths of the sea. Yes, we were so stupefied that we were unable to think of the dangers to come. Our amazement was that of people who cannot believe their eyes. Prostration succeeded as a natural consequence. There was not a word spoken. We stood motionless, with our feet rooted to the icy soil. No words could express the horror of our situation. As for West, when the schooner had disappeared in the abyss, I saw big tears fall from his eyes. The Halbrane that he loved so much was now an unknown quantity. Yes, our stout-hearted mate wept. 3 of our men had perished, and in what frightful fashion! I had seen Rogers and Gratian, 2 of our most faithful sailors, stretch out their hands in despair as they were knocked about by the rebounding of the schooner, and finally sink with her. The other man from the Falklands, an American, was crushed in its rush. His shapeless form lay in a pool of blood. 3 new victims within the last 10 days had to be inscribed on the register of those who died during this fatal voyage. Ah, fortune had favoured us up to the hour when the Halbrane was snatched from her own element, but her hand was now against us, and was not this last the worst blow? Must it not prove the stroke of death? The silence was broken by a tumult of despairing voices, whose despair was justified, indeed, by this irreparable misfortune. And I am sure that more than one thought it would have been better to have been on the Halbrane as she rebounded off the side of the iceberg. Everything would have been over then, as it was all over with Rogers and Gratian. This foolish expedition would thus have come to a conclusion worthy of such rashness and imprudence. At last the instinct of self-preservation triumphed, and, except Hearne, who stood some distance off, and affected silence, all the men shouted, "To the boat! To the boat!" These unfortunate fellows were out of their mind. Terror led them astray. They rushed towards the crag where our one boat, which could not hold them all, had been sheltered during the unloading of the schooner. Captain Len Guy and Jem West rushed after them. I joined them immediately, followed by the boatswain. We were armed, and resolved to make use of our arms. We had to prevent these furious men from seizing the boat, which did not belong to a few, but to all. "Hallo, sailors!" cried the captain. "Hallo!" repeated West. "Stop there, or we fire on the first who goes a step farther." Both threatened the men with their pistols. The boatswain pointed his gun at them. I held my rifle ready to fire. It was in vain. The frenzied men heard nothing, would not hear anything, and one of them fell, struck by the mate's bullet, just as he was crossing the last block. He was unable to catch on to the bank with his hands, and slipping on the frozen slope, he disappeared in the abyss. Was this the beginning of a massacre? Would others let themselves be killed at this place? Would the old hands side with the newcomers? At that moment I remarked that Hardy, Martin Holt, Francis Bury, and Stern hesitated about coming over to our side, while Hearne, still standing motionless at some distance, gave no encouragement to the rebels. However, we could not allow them to become masters of the boat, to bring it down, to embark 10 or 12 men, and to abandon us to our certain fate on this iceberg. They had almost reached the boat, heedless of danger and deaf to threats, when a second report was heard, and one of the sailors fell by a bullet from the boatswain's gun. One American and one Fuegian, less to be numbered amongst the sealing master's partisans. Then, in front of the boat, a man appeared. It was Dirk Peters, who had climbed the opposite slope. The half breed put one of his enormous hands on the stern, and with the other made a sign to the furious men to clear off. Dirk Peters being there, we no longer needed our arms, as he alone would suffice to protect the boat. And indeed, as 5 or 6 of the sailors were advancing, he went up to them, caught hold of the nearest by the belt, lifted him up, and sent him flying 10 paces off. The wretched man, not being able to catch hold of anything, would have rebounded into the sea had not Hearne seized him. Owing to the half-breed's intervention, the revolt was instantly quelled. Besides, we were coming up to the boat, and with us those of our men whose hesitation had not lasted long. No matter, the others were still 13 to our 10. Captain Len Guy made his appearance. Anger shone in his eyes, and with him was West, quite unmoved. Words failed the captain for some moments, but his look said what his tongue could not utter. At length, in a terrible voice, he said: "I ought to treat you as evil doers. However, I will only consider you as madmen. The boat belongs to everybody. It is now our only means of salvation, and you wanted to steal it, like cowards. Listen attentively to what I say for the last time. This boat, belonging to the Halbrane, is now the Halbrane herself. I am captain of it, and let him who disobey me beware." With these last words Captain Len Guy looked at Hearne, for whom this warning was expressly meant. The sealing master had not appeared in the last scene, not openly at least, but nobody doubted that he had urged his comrades to make off with the boat, and that he had every intention of doing the same again. "Now to the camp," said the captain, "and you, Dirk Peters, remain here." The half-breed's only reply was to nod his big head and betake himself to his post. The crew returned to the camp without the least hesitation. Some lay down in their sleeping places, others wandered about. Hearne neither tried to join them nor go near Martin Holt. Now that the sailors were reduced to idleness, there was nothing to do except to ponder on our critical situation, and invent some means of getting out of it. The captain, the mate, and the boatswain formed a council, and I took part in their deliberations. Captain Len began by saying: "We have protected our boat, and we shall continue to protect it." "Until death," declared West. "Who knows," said I, "whether we shall not soon be forced to embark?" "In that case," replied the captain, "as all cannot fit into it, it will be necessary to make a selection. Lots shall determine which of us are to go, and I shall not ask to be treated differently from the others." "We have not come to that, luckily," replied the boatswain. "The iceberg is solid, and there is no fear of its melting before winter." "No," assented West, "that is not to be feared. What it behoves us to do is, while watching the boat, to keep an eye on the provisions." "We are lucky," added Hurliguerly, "to have put our cargo in safety. Poor dear Halbrane! She will remain in these seas like the Jane, her elder sister." Yes, without doubt, and I thought so for many reasons, the one destroyed by the savages of Tsalal, the other by one of these catastrophes that no human power can prevent. "You are right," replied the captain, "and we must prevent our men from plundering. We are sure of enough provisions for 1 year, without counting what we may get by fishing." "And it is so much more the necessary, captain, to keep a close watch, because I have seen some hovering about the spirit casks." "I will see to that," replied West. "But," I then asked, "had we not better prepare ourselves for the fact that we may be compelled to winter on this iceberg?" "May Heaven avert such a terrible probability," replied the captain. "After all, if it were necessary, we could get through it, Mr. Jeorling," said the boatswain. "We could hollow out sheltering places in the ice, so as to be able to bear the extreme cold of the pole, and so long as we had sufficient to appease our hunger." At this moment the horrid recollection of the Grampus came to my mind. The scenes in which An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 20, Part-03. Unmerciful Disaster. Moreover, there would be danger in sending out our only boat on a voyage of discovery, as the current might carry it too far, or it might not find us again in the same place. And indeed, if the iceberg happened to get loose at the bottom, and to resume its interrupted drift, what would become of the men in the boat? The drawback was that the boat was too small to carry us all, with the necessary provisions. Now, of the seniors there remained 10 men, counting Dirk Peters. Of the new men there were 13, 23 in all. The largest number our boat could hold was from 11 to 12 persons. Then 11 of us, indicated by lot, would have to remain on this island of ice. And what would become of them? With regard to this, Hurliguerly made a sound observation. "After all," he said, "I don't know that those who would embark would be better off than those who remained. I am so doubtful of the result that I would willingly give up my place to anyone who wanted it." Perhaps the boatswain was right, but in my own mind, when I asked that the boat might be utilized, it was for the purpose of reconnoitring the iceberg. We finally decided to arrange everything with a view to wintering out, even were our ice mountain again to drift. "We may be sure that will be agreed to by our men," declared Hurliguerly. "What is necessary must be done," replied the mate, "and to day we must set to work." That was a sad day on which we began our preparations. Endicott the cook was the only man who submitted without murmuring. As a negro who cares little about the future, shallow and frivolous like all his race, he resigned himself easily to his fate, and that is, perhaps, true philosophy. Besides, when it came to the question of cooking, it mattered very little to him whether it was here or there, so long as his stoves were set up somewhere. So he said to his friend the mate, with his broad negro smile, "Luckily my kitchen did not go off with the schooner, and you shall see, Hurliguerly, if I do not make up dishes just as good as on board the Halbrane, so long as provisions don't grow scarce, of course." "Well, they will not be wanting for some time to come," replied the boatswain. "We need not fear hunger, but cold, such cold as would reduce you to an icicle the minute you cease to warm your feet. Cold that makes your skin crack and your skull split, even if we had some hundreds of tons of coal. But, all things being well calculated, there is only just what will do to boil this large kettle." "And that is sacred," cried Endicott. "Touching is forbidden, the kitchen before all." "And that is the reason why it never strikes you to pity yourself, you old nigger. You can always make sure of keeping your feet warm at your oven. What would you have, boatswain? You are a first-rate cook, or are you not? When you are, you take advantage of it, but I will remember to keep you a little place before my stove." That's good, Endicott. Each one shall have his turn. There is no privilege even for a boatswain. On the whole, it is better not to have fear famine. One can fight against the cold. We shall dig holes in the iceberg and cuddle ourselves up there. And why should we not have a general dwelling room? We could make a cave for ourselves with pickaxes. I have heard tell that ice preserves heat. Well, let it preserve ours, and that is all I ask of it. The hour had come for us to return to the camp and to seek our sleeping places. Dirk Peters alone refused to be relieved of his duty as watchman of the boat, and nobody thought of disputing the post with him. Captain Len Guy and West did not enter the tent until they had made certain that Hearne and his companions had gone to their usual place of rest. I came back likewise and went to bed. I could not tell how long I had been sleeping, nor what time it was, when I found myself rolling on the ground after a violent shock. What could be happening? Was it another capsize of the iceberg? We were all up in a second, then outside the tents in the full light of a night in the polar regions. A second floating mass of enormous size had just struck our iceberg, which had hoisted the anchor, as the sailors say, and was drifting towards the south. An unhoped for change in the situation had taken place. What were to be the consequences of our being no longer cast away at that place? The current was now carrying us in the direction of the pole. The first feeling of joy inspired by this conviction was, however, succeeded by all the terrors of the unknown. And what an unknown! Dirk Peters was only entirely rejoiced that we had resumed the route which he believed would lead us to the discovery of traces of his poor Pym. Far other ideas occupied the minds of his companions. Captain Len Guy no longer entertained any hope of rescuing his countrymen, and having reached the condition of despair, he was bound by his duty to take his crew back to the north, so as to clear the Antarctic Circle while the season rendered it possible to do so. And we were being carried away towards the south. Naturally enough, we were all deeply impressed by the fearfulness of our position, which may be summed up in a few words. We were no longer cast away with a possible ship, but the tenants of a floating iceberg, with no hope but that our monster tenement might encounter one of the whaling ships whose business in the deep waters lies between the Orkneys, New Georgia, and the Sandwich Islands. A quantity of things had been thrown into the ice by the collision which had set our iceberg afloat, but these were chiefly articles belonging to the Halbrane. Owing to the precaution that had been taken on the previous day, when the cargo was stowed away in the clefts, it had been only slightly damaged. What would become of us? Had all our reserves been swallowed up in that grim encounter? Now, the two icebergs formed but one, which was travelling south at the rate of 2 miles an hour. At this rate 30 hours would suffice to bring us to the point of the axis at which the terrestrial meridians unite. Did the current which was carrying us along pass on to the pole itself, or was there any land which might arrest our progress? This was another question, and I discussed it with the boatswain. "Nobody knows, Mr. Jeorling," was Hurliguerly's reply. "If the current goes to the pole, we shall go there, and if it doesn't, we shan't. An iceberg isn't a ship, and it has neither sails nor helm. It goes as the drift takes it." "That's true, boatswain, and therefore I had the idea that if 2 or 3 of us were to embark in the boat—" "Ah, you still hold to your notion of the boat?" "Certainly, for if there is land somewhere, is it not possible that the people of the Jane—" "Have come upon it, Mr. Jeorling, at 4,000 miles from Tsalal Island?" "Who knows, boatswain?" "That may be, but allow me to say that your argument will be reasonable when the land comes in sight, if ever it does so. Our captain will see what ought to be done, and he will remember that time presses. We cannot delay in these waters, and, after all, the one thing of real importance to us is to get out of the polar circle before the winter makes it impassable." There was good sense in Hurliguerly's words. I could not deny the fact. During that day the greater part of the cargo was placed in the interior of a vast cave like fissure in the side of the iceberg, where, even in the case of a second collision, casks and barrels would be in safety. Our men then assisted Endicott to set up his cooking stove between 2 blocks, so that it was firmly fixed, and they heaped up a great mass of coals close to it. No murmurs, no recriminations disturbed these labours. It was evident that silence was deliberately maintained. The crew obeyed the captain and West because they gave no orders but such as were of urgent necessity. But afterwards would these men allow the authority of their leaders to be uncontested? How long would the recruits from the Falklands, who were already exasperated by the disasters of our enterprise, resist their desire to seize upon the boat and escape? I did not think they would make the attempt, however, so long as our iceberg should continue to drift, for the boat could not outstrip its progress. But if it were to run aground once more, to strike upon the coast of an island or a continent, what would not these unfortunate creatures do to escape the horrors of wintering under such conditions? In the afternoon, during the hour of rest allowed to the crew, I had a second conversation with Dirk Peters. I had taken my customary seat at the top of the iceberg, and had occupied it for half an hour, being, as may be supposed, deep in thought, when I saw the half breed coming quickly up the slope. We had exchanged hardly a dozen words since the iceberg had begun to move again. When Dirk Peters came up to me, he did not address me at first, and was so intent on his thoughts that I was not quite sure he saw me. At length he leaned back against an ice block and spoke. "Mr. Jeorling," he said, "you remember in your cabin in the Halbrane I told you the affair of the Grampus?" I remembered well. "I told you that Parker's name was not Parker, that it was Holt, and that he was Ned Holt's brother?" "I know, Dirk Peters," I replied. "But why do you refer to that sad story again?" "Why, Mr. Jeorling? Have you never said anything to anybody?" "Not to anybody," I protested. "How could you suppose I should be so ill advised, so imprudent, as to divulge your secret, a secret which ought never to pass our lips, a dead secret?" "Dead, yes, dead. And yet, understand me, it seems to me that, among the crew, something is known." I instantly recalled to mind what the boatswain had told me concerning a certain conversation in which he had overheard Hearne prompting Martin Holt to ask the half breed what were the circumstances of his brother's death on board the Grampus. Had a portion of the secret got out, or was this apprehension on the part of Dirk Peters purely imaginary? "Explain yourself," I said. "Understand me, Mr. Jeorling. I'm a bad hand at explaining. Yesterday I have thought of nothing else since Martin Holt took me aside, far from the others, and told me that he wished to speak to me." "Of the Grampus?" "Of the Grampus, yes, and of his brother Ned Holt. For the first time he uttered that name before me. And yet we have sailed together for nearly 3 months." The half breed's voice was so changed that I could hardly hear him. "It seemed to me," he resumed, "that in Martin Holt's mind no, I was not mistaken there was something like a suspicion." "But tell me what he said. Tell me exactly what he asked you. What is it?" I felt sure that the question put by Martin Holt, whatsoever its bearing, had been inspired by Hearne. Nevertheless, as I considered it well that the half breed should know nothing of the sealing master's disquieting and inexplicable intervention in this tragic affair, I decided upon concealing it from him. "He asked me," Dirk Peters replied, "did I not remember Ned Holt of the Grampus, and whether he had perished in the fight with the mutineers or in the shipwreck, whether he was one of the men who had been abandoned with Captain Barnard. In short, he asked me if I could tell him how his brother died." "Ah, how?" No idea could be conveyed of the horror with which the half breed uttered words which revealed a profound loathing of himself. "And what answer did you make to Martin Holt?" "None, none." "You should have said that Ned Holt perished in the wreck of the brig." "I could not. Understand me, I could not. That two brothers are so like each other. In Martin Holt I seemed to see Ned Holt. I was afraid. I got away from him." The half breed drew himself up with a sudden movement, and I sat thinking, leaning my head on my hands. These tardy questions of Holt's respecting his brother were put, I had no doubt whatsoever, at the instigation of Hearne. But what was his motive? And was it at the Falklands that he discovered the secret of Dirk Peters? I had not breathed a word on the subject to any one. To the second question no answer suggested itself. The first involved a serious issue. Did the sealing master merely desire to gratify his enmity against Dirk Peters, the only one of the Falkland sailors who had always taken the side of Captain Len Guy, and who had prevented the seizure of the boat by Hearne and his companions? Did he hope, by arousing the wrath and vengeance of Martin Holt, to detach the sailing master from his allegiance, and induce him to become an accomplice in Hearne's own designs? And, in fact, when it was a question of sailing the boat in these seas, had he not imperative need of Martin Holt, one of the best seamen of the Halbrane? A man who would succeed where Hearne and his companions would fail, if they had only themselves to depend upon? I became lost in this labyrinth of hypotheses, and it must be admitted that its complications added largely to the troubles of an already complicated position. When I raised my eyes, Dirk Peters had disappeared. He had said what he came to say, and he now knew that I had not betrayed his confidence. The customary precautions were taken for the night, no individual being allowed to remain outside the camp, with the exception of the half breed who was in charge of the boat. The following day was the 31st of January. I pushed back the canvas of the tent which I shared with Captain Len Guy and West respectively, as each succeeded the other on release from the alternate watch, very early, and experienced a severe disappointment. Mist everywhere, nay, more than mist, a thick, yellow, mouldy smelling fog, and more than this again, the temperature had fallen sensibly. This was probably a forewarning of the austral winter. The summit of our ice mountain was lost in vapour, in a fog which would not resolve itself into rain, but would continue to muffle up the horizon. "Bad luck," said the boatswain, "for now if we were to pass by land we should not perceive it. And our drift?" "More considerable than yesterday, Mr. Jeorling. The captain has sounded, and he makes the speed no less than between 3 and 4 miles." "And what do you conclude from this?" "I conclude that we must be within a narrower sea, since the current is so strong. I should not be surprised if we had land on both sides of us within 10 or 15 miles." "Then this would be a wide strait that cuts the Antarctic continent?" "Yes, our captain is of that opinion." "And, holding that opinion, is he not going to make an attempt to reach one or other of the coasts of this strait?" "And how?" "With the boat." "Risk the boat in the midst of this fog!" exclaimed the boatswain, as he crossed his arms. "What are you thinking of, Mr. Jeorling? Can we cast anchor to wait for it? And oh, the chances would be that we should never see it again. Ah, if we only had the Halbrane!" But there was no longer a Halbrane. In spite of the difficulty of the ascent through the half condensed vapour, I climbed to the top of the iceberg, but when I had gained that eminence I strove in vain to pierce the impenetrable grey mantle in which the waters were wrapped. I remained there, hustled by An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 21. Amid the Mists. So this was the sum of all our efforts, trials, and disappointments. Not to speak of the destruction of the Halbrane, the expedition had already cost 9 lives. From 32 men who embarked on the schooner our number was reduced to 23. How low was that figure yet to fall! Between the South Pole and Antarctic Circle lay 20 degrees, and those would have to be cleared in a month or 6 weeks at the most. If not, the iceberg barrier would be reformed and closed up. As for wintering in that part of the Antarctic Circle, not a man of us could have survived it. Besides, we had lost all hope of rescuing the survivors of the Jane, and the sole desire of the crew was to escape as quickly as possible from the awful solitudes of the south. Our drift, which had been south down to the pole, was now north, and if that direction should continue, perhaps we might be favoured with such good fortune as would make up for all the evil that had befallen us. In any case, there was nothing for it but, in familiar phrase, to let ourselves go. The mist did not lift during the end 3rd and 4th February, and it would have been difficult to make out the rate of progress of our iceberg since it had passed the pole. Captain Len Guy, however, and West considered themselves safe in reckoning it at 250 miles. The current did not seem to have diminished in speed or changed its course. It was now beyond a doubt that we were moving between two halves of a continent, one on the east, the other on the west, which formed the vast Antarctic region, and I thought it was a matter of great regret that we could not get aground on one or the other side of this vast strait, whose surface would presently be solidified by the coming of winter. When I expressed this sentiment to Captain Len Guy, he made me the only logical answer: "What would you have, Mr. Joerling? We are powerless. There is nothing to be done, and the persistent fog is the worst part of our ill luck. I no longer know where we are. It is impossible to take an observation, and this befalls us just as the sun is about to disappear for long months." "Let me come back to the question of the boat," said I. "For the last time, could we not, with the boat—" "Go on a discovery cruise? Can you think of such a thing? That would be an imprudence I would not commit, even though the crew would allow me." I was on the point of exclaiming, "And what if your brother and your countrymen have found refuge on some spot of the land that undoubtedly lies about us?" But I restrained myself. Of what avail was it to reawaken our captain's grief? He too must have contemplated this eventuality, and he had not renounced his purpose of further search without being fully convinced of the folly of a last attempt. During those 3 days of fog I had not caught sight of Dirk Peters, or rather he had made no attempt to approach, but had remained inflexibly at his post by the boat. Martin Holt's question respecting his brother Ned seemed to indicate that his secret was known, at least in part, and the half breed held himself more than ever aloof, sleeping while the others watched, and watching in their time of sleep. I even wondered whether he regretted having confided in me, and fancied that he had aroused my repugnance by his sad story. If so, he was mistaken. I deeply pitied the poor half breed. Nothing could exceed the melancholy monotony of the hours which we passed in the midst of a fog so thick that the wind could not lift its curtain. The position of the iceberg could not be ascertained. It went with the current at a like speed, and had it been motionless there would have been no appreciable difference for us, for the wind had fallen, at least so we supposed, and not a breath was stirring. The flame of a torch held up in the air did not flicker. The silence of space was broken only by the clangour of sea birds, which came in muffled croaking tones through the stifling atmosphere of vapour. Petrels and albatross swept the top of the iceberg, where they kept a useless watch in their flight. In what direction were those swift-winged creatures, perhaps already driven towards the confines of the Arctic region, but the approach of winter, bound? We could not tell. One day the boatswain, who was determined to solve this question if possible, having mounted to the extreme top, not without risk of breaking his neck, came into such violent contact with a Quebranta huesos, a sort of gigantic petrel measuring 12 feet, with spread wings, that he was flung on his back. "Curse the bird!" he said on his return to the camp, addressing the observation to me. "I have had a narrow escape. A thump, and down I went, sprawling. I saved myself, I don't know how, for I was all but over the side. Those icebergs, you know, slip through one's fingers like water. I called out to the bird, 'Can't you even look before you, you fool?' But what was the good of that? The big blunderer did not even beg my pardon." In the afternoon of the same day our ears were assailed by a hideous braying from below. Hurliguerly remarked that as there were no asses to treat us to the concert, it must have been given by penguins. Hitherto these countless dwellers in the polar regions had not thought proper to accompany us on our moving island. We had not even seen one, either at the foot of the iceberg or on the drifting packs. There could be no doubt that they were there in thousands, for the music was unmistakably that of a multitude of performers. Now those birds frequent by choice the edges of the coasts of islands and continents in high latitudes, or the ice fields in their neighbourhood. Was not their presence an indication that land was near? I asked Captain Len Guy what he thought of the presence of these birds. "I think what you think, Mr. Jeorling," he replied. "Since we have been drifting, none of them have taken refuge on the iceberg, and here they are now in crowds. If we may judge by their deafening cries, from whence do they come? No doubt from land, which is probably near." "Is this West's opinion?" "Yes, Mr. Jeorling, and you know he is not given to vain imaginations." "Certainly not." "And then another thing has struck both him and me, which has apparently escaped your attention. It is that the braying of the penguins is mingled with a sound like the lowing of cattle. Listen, and you will readily distinguish it." I listened, and sure enough the orchestra was more full than I had supposed. "I hear the lowing plainly," I said. "There are, then, seals and walruses also in the sea at the base." "That is certain, Mr. Jeorling, and I conclude from the fact that those animals, both birds and mammals, very rare since we left Tsalal Island, frequent the waters into which the currents have carried us." "Of course, captain, of course. Oh, what a misfortune it is that we should be surrounded by this impenetrable fog!" "Which prevents us from getting down to the base of the iceberg. There, no doubt, we should discover whether there are seaweed drifts around us. If that be so, it would be another sign." "Why not try, captain?" "No, no, Mr. Jeorling, that might lead to falls, and I will not permit anybody to leave the camp. If land be there, I imagine our iceberg will strike it before long." "And if it does not?" "If it does not, how are we to make it?" I thought to myself that the boat might very well be used in the latter case, but Captain Len Guy preferred to wait, and perhaps this was the wiser course under our circumstances. At 8 o'clock that evening the half condensed mist was so compact that it was difficult to walk through. The composition of the air seemed to be changed, as though it were passing into a solid state. It was not possible to discern whether the fog had any effect upon the compass. I knew the matter had been studied by meteorologists, and that they believe they may safely affirm that the needle is not affected by this condition of the atmosphere. I will add here that since we had left the South Pole behind, no confidence could be placed in the indications of the compass. It had gone wild at the approach to the magnetic pole. to which we were no doubt on the way. Nothing could be known, therefore, concerning the course of the iceberg. The sun did not quite set below the horizon at this period, yet the waters were wrapped in tolerably deep darkness at 9 o'clock in the evening, when the muster of the crew took place. On this occasion each man, as usual, answered to his name except Dirk Peters. The call was repeated in the loudest of Hurliguerly's stentorian tones. No reply. "Has nobody seen Dirk Peters during the day?" inquired the captain. "Nobody," answered the boatswain. "Can anything have happened to him?" "Don't be afraid," cried the boatswain. "Dirk Peters is in his element, and as much at his ease in the fog as a polar bear. He has got out of one bad scrape, he will get out of a second." I let Hurliguerly have his say, knowing well why the half breed kept out of the way. That night none of us, I am sure, could sleep. We were smothered in the tents, for lack of oxygen, and we were all more or less under the influence of a strange sort of presentiment, as though our fate were about to change, for better or worse, if indeed it could be worse. The night wore on without any alarm, and at 6 o'clock in the morning each of us came out to breathe a more wholesome air. The state of things was unchanged. The density of the fog was extraordinary. It was, however, found that the barometer had risen too quickly, it is true, for the rise to be serious. Presently other signs of change became evident. The wind, which was growing colder, a south wind, since we had passed beyond the South Pole, began to blow a full gale, and the noises from below were heard more distinctly through the space swept by the atmospheric currents. At 9 o'clock the iceberg doffed its cap of vapour quite suddenly, producing an indescribable transformation scene which no fairy's wand could have accomplished in less time or with greater success. In a few moments the sky was clear to the extreme verge of the horizon, and the sea reappeared. An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 22. In Camp. A little after noon the iceberg was within a mile of the land. After dinner the crew climbed up to the topmost block, on which Dirk Peters was stationed. On our approach the half breed descended the opposite slope, and when I reached the top he was no longer to be seen. The land on the north evidently formed a continent or island of considerable extent. On the west there was a sharply projecting cape, surmounted by a sloping height which resembled an enormous seal's head on the side view. Then beyond that was a wide stretch of sea. On the east the land was prolonged out of sight. Each one of us took in the position. It depended on the current whether it would carry the iceberg into an eddy which might drive it on the coast, or continue to drift it towards the north. Which was the more admissible hypothesis? Captain Len Guy, West, Hurliguerly, and I talked over the matter, while the crew discussed it amongst themselves. Finally it was agreed that the current tended rather to carry the iceberg towards the northern point of land. "After all," said Captain Len Guy, "if it is habitable during the months of the summer season, it does not look like being inhabited, since we cannot descry a human being on the shore." "Let us bear in mind, captain," said I, "that the iceberg is not calculated to attract attention as the Halbrane would have done." "Evidently, Mr. Jeorling, and the natives, if there were any, would have been collected on the beach to see the Halbrane already." "We must not conclude, captain, because we do not see any natives." "Certainly not, Mr. Jeorling, but you will agree with me that the aspect of this land is very unlike that of Tsalal Island when the Jane reached it. There is nothing here but desolation and barrenness." "I acknowledge that. Barrenness and desolation, that is all. Nevertheless, I want to ask you whether it is your intention to go ashore, captain?" "With the boat?" "With the boat, should the current carry our iceberg away from the land." "We have not an hour to lose, Mr. Jeorling, and the delay of a few hours might condemn us to a cruel winter stay, if we arrive too late at the iceberg barrier." "And, considering the distance, we are not too soon," observed West. "I grant it," I replied, still persisting, "but to leave this land behind us without ever having set foot on it, without having made sure that it does not preserve the traces of an encampment, if your brother, his companions—" Captain Len Guy shook his head. How could the castaways have supported life in this desolate region for several months? Besides, the British flag was hoisted on the summit of the iceberg, and William Guy would have recognized it and come down to the shore had he been living. No one. No one. At this moment, West, who had been observing certain points of approach, said, "Let us wait a little before we come to a decision. In less than an hour we shall be able to decide. Our speed is slackening, it seems to me, and it is possible that an eddy may bring us obliquely to the coast." "That is my opinion too," said the boatswain, "and if our floating machine is not stationary, it is nearly so. It seems to be turning round." West and Hurliguerly were not mistaken. For some reason or other, the iceberg was getting out of the course which it had followed continuously. A gyratory movement had succeeded to that of drifting, owing to the action of an eddy which set towards the coast. Besides, several ice mountains in front of us had just run aground on the edge of the shore. It was, then, useless to discuss whether we should take to the boat or not. According as we approached, the desolation of the land became more and more apparent, and the prospect of enduring 6 months wintering there would have appalled the stoutest hearts. At 5 in the afternoon the iceberg plunged into a deep rift in the coast ending in a long point on the right, and there stuck fast. "On shore! On shore!" burst from every man, like a single exclamation, and the men were already hurrying down the slope of the iceberg when West commanded, "Wait for orders." Some hesitation was shown, especially on the part of Hearne and several of his comrades. Then the instinct of discipline prevailed, and finally the whole crew ranged themselves around Captain Len Guy. It was not necessary to lower the boat, the iceberg being in contact with the point. The captain, the boatswain, and myself, preceding the others, were the first to quit the camp. Ours were the first human feet to tread this virgin and volcanic soil. We walked 20 minutes on rough land, strewn with rocks of igneous origin, solidified lava, dusty slag, and grey ashes, but without enough clay to grow even the hardiest plants. With some risk and difficulty, Captain Len Guy, the boatswain, and I succeeded in climbing the hill. This exploit occupied a whole hour. Although evening had come now, it brought no darkness in its train. From the top of the hill we could see over an extent of from 30 to 40 miles, and this was what we saw. Behind us lay the open sea, laden with floating masses. A great number of these had recently heaped themselves up against the beach and rendered it almost inaccessible. On the west was a strip of hilly land, which extended beyond our sight, and was washed on the east side by a boundless sea. It was evident that we had been carried by the drift through a strait. Ah, if only we had our Halbrane! But our sole possession was a frail craft, barely capable of containing a dozen men, and we were 23. There was nothing for it but to go down to the shore again, to carry the tents to the beach, and take measures in view of a winter sojourn under the terrible conditions imposed upon us by circumstances. On our return to the coast, the boatswain discovered several caverns in the gigantic cliffs, sufficiently spacious to house us all and afford storage for the cargo of the Halbrane. Whatever might be our ultimate decision, we could not do better than place our material and install ourselves in this opportune shelter. After we had reascended the slopes of the iceberg and reached our camp, Captain Len Guy had the men mustered. The only missing man was Dirk Peters, who had decidedly isolated himself from the crew. There was nothing to fear from him, however. He would be the faithful against the mutinous, and under all circumstances we might count upon him. When the circle had been formed, Captain Len Guy spoke, without allowing any sign of discouragement to appear, and explained the position with the utmost frankness and lucidity, stating, in the first place, that it was absolutely necessary to lower the cargo to the coast and stow it away in one of the caverns. Concerning the vital question of food, he stated that the supply of flour, preserved meat, and dried vegetables would suffice for the winter, however prolonged; and on that of fuel he was satisfied that we should not want for coal, provided it was not wasted, and it would be possible to economize it, as the hibernating waifs might brave the cold of the polar zone under a covering of snow and a roof of ice. Was the captain's tone of security feigned? I did not think so, especially as West approved of what he said. A third question raised by Hearne remained, and was well calculated to arouse jealousy and anger amongst the crew. It was the question of the use to be made of the only craft remaining to us. Ought the boat to be kept for the needs of our hibernation, or used to enable us to return to the iceberg barrier? Captain Len Guy would not pronounce upon this. He desired to postpone the decision for 24 or 48 hours. The boat, carrying the provisions necessary for such a voyage, could not accommodate more than 11, or at the outside 12 men. If the departure of the boat were agreed to, then its passengers must be selected by lot. The captain proceeded to state that neither West, the boatswain, I, nor he would claim any privilege, but would submit to the fortune of the lot with all the others. Both Martin Holt and Hardy were perfectly capable of taking the boat to the fishing grounds, where the whalers would still be found. Then those to whom the lot should fall were not to forget their comrades left to winter on the 86th parallel, and were to send a ship to take them off at the return of summer. All this was said in a tone as calm as it was firm. I must do Captain Len Guy the justice to say that he rose to the occasion. When he had concluded, without any interruption even from Hearne, no one made a remark. There was indeed none to be made, since, in the given case, lots were to be drawn under conditions of perfect equality. The hour of rest having arrived, each man entered the camp, partook of the supper prepared by Endicott, and went to sleep for the last time under the tents. Dirk Peters had not reappeared, and I sought for him in vain. On the following day, the 7th of February, everybody set to work early with a will. The boat was let down with all due precaution to the base of the iceberg, and drawn up by the men on a little sandy beach out of reach of the water. It was in perfectly good condition and thoroughly serviceable. The boatswain then set to work on the former contents of the Halbrane: furniture, bedding, sails, clothing, instruments, and utensils. Stowed away in a cabin, these things would no longer be exposed to the knocking about and damage of the iceberg. The cases containing preserved food and the casks of spirits were rapidly carried ashore. I worked with the captain and West at this onerous task, and Dirk Peters also turned up and lent the valuable assistance of his great strength, but he did not utter a word to any one. Our occupation continued on the 8th, 9th, and 10th February, and our task was finished in the afternoon of the 10th. The cargo was safely stowed in the interior of a large grotto, with access to it by a narrow opening. We were to inhabit the adjoining grotto, and Endicott set up his kitchen in the latter, on the advice of the boatswain. Thus we should profit by the heat of the stove, which was to cook our food and warm the cavern during the long days, or rather the long nights, of the austral winter. During the process of housing and storing, I observed nothing to arouse suspicion in the bearing of Hearne and the Falklands men. Nevertheless, the half breed was kept on guard at the boat, which might easily have been seized upon the beach. Hurliguerly, who observed his comrades closely, appeared less anxious. On that same evening, Captain Len Guy, having reassembled his people, stated that the question should be discussed on the morrow, adding that, if it were decided in the affirmative, lots should be drawn immediately. No reply was made. It was late, and half dark outside, for at this date the sun was on the edge of the horizon, and would very soon disappear below it. I had been asleep for some hours when I was awakened by a great shouting at a short distance. I sprang up instantly and darted out of the cavern, simultaneously with the captain and West, who had been suddenly aroused from sleep. "The boat! The boat!" cried West. The boat was no longer in its place, that place so jealously guarded by Dirk Peters. After they had pushed the boat into the sea, 3 men had got into it with bales and casks, while 10 others strove to control the half breed. Hearne was there, and Martin Holt also. The latter, it seemed to me, was not interfering. Those wretches, then, intended to depart before the lots were drawn. They meant to forsake us. They had succeeded in surprising Dirk Peters, and they would have killed him had he not fought hard for his life. In the face of this mutiny, knowing our inferiority of numbers, and not knowing whether he might count on all the old crew, Captain Len Guy re entered the cavern with West in order to procure arms. Hearne and his accomplices were armed. I was about to follow them, when the following words arrested my steps. The half breed, overpowered by numbers, had been knocked down, and at this moment Martin Holt, in gratitude to the man who saved his life, was rushing to his aid, but Hearne called out to him: "Leave the fellow alone, and come with us." Martin Holt hesitated. "Yes, leave him alone, I say. Leave Dirk Peters, the assassin of your brother, alone." "The assassin of my brother?" "Your brother, killed on board the Grampus." "Killed? By Dirk Peters?" "Yes, killed and eaten, eaten," replied Hearne, who pronounced the hateful words with a kind of howl. And then, at a sign from Hearne, 2 of his comrades seized Martin Holt and dragged him into the boat. Hearne was instantly followed by all those whom he had induced to join in his criminal deed. At that moment Dirk Peters rose from the ground, and sprang upon one of the Falkland men as he was in the act of stepping on the platform of the boat, lifted him up bodily, hurled him round his head, and dashed his brains An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 23. Found at Last. The question of our wintering on the land whereon we had been thrown was settled for us, but, after all, the situation was not changed for those among the 9, now only remaining of the 23, who should not have drawn the lot of departure. Who could speculate upon the chances of the whole 9? Might not all of them have drawn the lot of stay? And, when every chance was fully weighed, was that of those who had left us the best? To this question there could be no answer. When the boat had disappeared, Captain Len Guy and his companions retraced their steps towards the cavern in which we must live for all the time during which we could not go out, in the dread darkness of the Antarctic winter. My first thought was of Dirk Peters, who, being wounded, could not follow us when we hurried to the other side of the point. On reaching the cavern I failed to find the half breed. Was he severely wounded? Should we have to mourn the death of this man who was as faithful to us as to his poor Pym? "Let us search for him, Mr. Joerling," cried the boatswain. "We will go together," said the captain. "Dirk Peters would never have forsaken us, and we will not forsake him." "Would he come back," said I, "now that what he thought was known to him and me only has come out?" I informed my companions of the reason why the name of Ned Holt had been changed to that of Parker in Arthur Pym's narrative, and of the circumstances under which the half breed had apprised me of the fact. At the same time I urged every consideration that might exculpate him, dwelling in particular upon the point that if the lot had fallen to Dirk Peters, he would have been the victim of the others' hunger. "Dirk Peters confided this secret to you only?" inquired Captain Len Guy. "To me only, captain." "And you have kept it?" "Absolutely." "Then I cannot understand how it came to the knowledge of Hearne." "At first," I replied, "I thought Hearne might have talked in his sleep, and that it was by chance Martin Holt learned the secret. After reflection, however, I recalled to mind that when the half breed related the scene on the Grampus to me, he was in my cabin, and the side sash was raised. I have reason to think that the man at the wheel overheard our conversation. Now that man was Hearne, who, in order to hear it more clearly, let go the wheel so that the Halbrane lurched." "I remember," said West. "I questioned the fellow sharply, and sent him down into the hold." "Well, then, captain," I resumed, "it was from that day that Hearne made up to Martin Holt. Hurliguerly called my attention to the fact." "Of course he did," said the boatswain, "for Hearne, not being capable of managing the boat which he intended to seize, required a master hand like Holt." "And so," I said, "he kept on urging Holt to question the half breed concerning his brother's fate, and you know how Holt came at last to learn the fearful truth. Martin Holt seemed to be stupefied by the revelation. The others dragged him away, and now he is with them." We were all agreed that things had happened as I supposed, and now the question was, did Dirk Peters, in his present state of mind, mean to absent himself? Would he consent to resume his place among us? We all left the cavern, and after an hour's search we came in sight of Dirk Peters, whose first impulse was to escape from us. At length, however, Hurliguerly and Francis came up with him. He stood still and made no resistance. I advanced and spoke to him. The others did the same. Captain Len Guy offered him his hand, which he took after a moment's hesitation. Then, without uttering a single word, he returned towards the beach. From that day no allusion was ever made to the tragic story of the Grampus. Dirk Peters' wound proved to be slight. He merely wrapped a piece of sailcloth round the injured arm, and went off to his work with entire unconcern. We made all the preparations in our power for a prolonged hibernation. Winter was threatening us. For some days past The sun hardly showed at all through the mists. The temperature fell to 36° and would rise no more, while the solar rays, casting shadows of endless length upon the soil, gave hardly any heat. The captain made us put on warm woollen clothes without waiting for the cold to become more severe. Icebergs, packs, streams, and drifts came in greater numbers from the south. Some of these struck and stayed upon the coast, which was already heaped up with ice, but the greater number disappeared in the direction of the northeast. "All these pieces," said the boatswain, "will go to the closing up of the iceberg wall. If Hearne and his lot of scoundrels are not ahead of them, I imagine they will find the door shut, and as they have no key to open it with. I suppose you think, boatswain, that our case is less desperate than theirs?" "I do think so, Mr. Jeorling, and I have always thought so. If everything had been done as it was settled, and the lot had fallen to me to go with the boat, I would have given up my turn to one of the others. After all, there is something in feeling dry ground under our feet. I don't wish the death of anybody, but if Hearne and his friends do not succeed in clearing the iceberg barrier, if they are doomed to pass the winter on the ice, reduced for food to a supply that will only last a few weeks, you know the fate that awaits them." "Yes, a fate worse than ours." "And besides," said the boatswain, "even supposing they do reach the Antarctic Circle, if the whalers have already left the fishing grounds, it is not a laden and overladen craft that will keep the sea until the Australian coasts are in sight." This was my opinion, and also that of the captain at West. During the following 4 days we completed the storage of the whole of our belongings, and made some excursions into the interior of the country, finding all barren, and not a trace that any landing had ever been made there. One day Captain Len Guy proposed that we should give a geographical name to the region whither the iceberg had carried us. It was named Halbrane Land, in memory of our schooner, and we called the strait that separated the two parts of the polar continent the Jane Sound. Then we took to shooting the penguins which swarmed upon the rocks, and to capturing some of the amphibious animals which frequented the beach. We began to feel the want of fresh meat, and Endicott's cooking rendered seal and walrus flesh quite palatable. Besides, the fat of these creatures would serve at need to warm the cavern and feed the cooking stove. Our most formidable enemy would be the cold, and we must fight it by every means within our power. It remained to be seen whether the amphibia would not forsake Halbrane Land at the approach of winter, and seek a less rigorous climate in lower latitudes. Fortunately, there were hundreds of other animals to secure our little company from hunger, and even from thirst, at need. The beach was the home of numbers of galapagos, a kind of turtle, so called from an archipelago in the equinoctial sea. There also they abound, and mentioned by Arthur Pym as supplying food to the islanders. It will be remembered that Pym and Peters found 3 of these galapagos in the native boat which carried them away from Tsalal Island. The movement of these huge creatures is slow, heavy, and waddling. They have thin necks 2 feet long, triangular snake-like heads, and can go without food for very long periods. Arthur Pym had compared the Antarctic turtles to dromedaries, because, like those ruminants, they have a pouch just where the neck begins, which contains from 2 to 3 gallons of cold fresh water. He relates, before the scene of the lot drawing, that but for one of these turtles the shipwrecked crew of the Grampus must have died of hunger and thirst. If Pym is to be believed, some of the great turtles weigh from 12 to 1,500 pounds. Those of Halbrane Land did not go beyond 700 or 800 pounds, but their flesh was none the less savoury. On the 19th of February an incident occurred. an incident which those who acknowledge the intervention of Providence in human affairs will recognize as providential. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. The weather was calm, the sky was tolerably clear, the thermometer stood at 32° Fahrenheit. We were assembled in the cavern, with the exception of the boatswain, waiting for our breakfast, which Endicott was preparing, and were about to take our places at table, when we heard a call from outside. The voice was Hurliguerly's, and we hurried out. On seeing us, he cried, "Come, come quickly!" He was standing on a rock at the foot of the hillock above the beach in which Halbrane Land ended beyond the point, and his right hand was stretched out towards the sea. "What is it?" asked Captain Len Guy. "A boat." "Is the Halbrane's boat coming back?" "No, captain, it is not." Then we perceived a boat, not to be mistaken for that of our schooner in form or dimensions, drifting without oars or paddle, seemingly abandoned to the current. We had but one idea in common: to seize at any cost upon this derelict craft, which would perhaps prove our salvation. But how were we to reach it? How were we to get it to the point of Halbrane Land? While we were looking distractedly at the boat and at each other, there came a sudden splash at the end of the hillock, as though a body had fallen into the sea. It was Dirk Peters, who, having flung off his clothes, had sprung from the top of a rock, and was swimming rapidly towards the boat before we made him out. We cheered him heartily. I never beheld anything like that swimming. He bounded through the waves like a porpoise, and indeed he possessed the strength and swiftness of one. What might not be expected of such a man? In a few minutes the half breed had swum several cables' lengths towards the boat in an oblique direction. We could only see his head like a black speck on the surface of the rolling waves. A period of suspense, of intense watching of the brave swimmer, succeeded. Surely, surely he would reach the boat. But must he not be carried away with it? Was it to be believed that even his great strength would enable him, swimming, to tow it to the beach? "After all, why should there not be oars in the boat?" said the boatswain. "He has it! He has it! Hurrah, Dirk, hurrah!" shouted Hurliguerly, and Endicott echoed his exultant cheer. The half breed had, in fact, reached the boat, and raised himself alongside, half out of the water. His big strong hand grasped the side, and at the risk of causing the boat to capsize, he hoisted himself up to the side, stepped over it, and sat down to draw his breath. Almost instantly a shout reached our ears. It was uttered by Dirk Peters. What had he found? Paddles, it must An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 24. 11 Years in a Few Pages. The heading of the following chapter indicates that the adventures of William Guy and his companions, after destruction of the English schooner, and the details of their history subsequent to the departure of Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters, are about to be narrated with all possible brevity. We carried our treasure trove to the cavern, and had happiness of restoring all 4 men to life. In reality it was hunger, nothing but hunger, which had reduced the poor fellows to the semblance of death. On the 8th of February, 1828, the crew of the Jane, having no reason to doubt the good faith of the population of Tsalal Island, or that of their chief Too Wit, disembarked in order to visit the village of Klock Klock, having previously put the schooner into a state of defence, leaving 6 men on board. The crew, counting William Guy, the captain, Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters, formed a body of 32 men, armed with guns, pistols, and knives. The dog Tiger accompanied them. On reaching the narrow gorge leading to the village, preceded and followed by the numerous warriors of Too Wit, the little company divided, Arthur Pym, Dirk Peters, and Allen the sailor entering a cleft in the hillside, with the intention of crossing it to the other side. From that moment their companions were never to see them more. After a short interval a shock was felt. The opposite hill fell down in a vast heap, burying William Guy and his 28 companions. 22 of these unfortunate men were crushed to death on the instant, and their bodies would never be found under that mass of earth. 7, miraculously sheltered in the depth of a great cleft of the hill, had survived the catastrophe. These were William Guy, Patterson, Roberts, Coyin, Trinkle, also Forbes and Sexton, since dead. As for Tiger, they knew not whether he had perished in the landslip or whether he had escaped. There existed in the right side of the hill, as well as in the left, on either side of the fissure, certain winding passages, and it was by crawling along these in the darkness that William Guy, Patterson, and the others reached a cavity which let in light and air in abundance. From this shelter they beheld the attack on the Jane by 60 pirogues, the defence made by the 6 men on board, the invasion of the ship by the savages, and finally the explosion which caused the death of a vast number of natives, as well as the complete destruction of the ship. Too Wit and the Tsalal Islanders were at first terrified by the effects of this explosion, but probably still more disappointed. Their instincts of pillage could not be gratified, because some valueless wreckage was all that remained of the ship and her cargo, and they had no reason to suppose that any of the crew had survived the cleverly contrived collapse of the hill. Hence it came about that Arthur Pym and Dirk Peters on the one side, and William Guy and his companions on the other, were enabled to remain undisturbed in the labyrinth of Klock Klock, where they fed on the flesh of bitterns. These they could catch with their hands, and the fruit of the nut trees which grow on the hillsides. They procured fire by rubbing pieces of soft against pieces of hard wood. There was a quantity of both within their reach. After a whole week of this confinement, Arthur Pym and the half-breed had succeeded, as we know, in leaving their hiding-place, securing a boat, and abandoning Tsalal Island, but William Guy and his companions had not yet found an opportunity to escape. After they had been shut up in the labyrinth for 21 days, the birds on which they lived began to fail them, and they recognized that their only means of escaping hunger— they had not to fear thirst, for there was a spring of fresh water in the interior of the hill— was to go down again to the coast, lay hands upon a native boat, and get out to sea. Where were the fugitives to go, and what was to become of them without provisions? These were the questions that had to be asked, and which nobody could answer. Nevertheless, they would not have hesitated to attempt the adventure if they could have a few hours of darkness. But at that time of the year the sun did not as yet go down behind the horizon of the 84th parallel. Death would probably have put an end to their misery had not the situation been changed by the following events. On the 22nd of February, in the morning, William Guy and Patterson were talking together in terrible perplexity of mind at the orifice of the cavity that opened upon the country. They no longer knew how to provide for the wants of 7 persons, who were then reduced to eating nuts only, and were suffering in consequence from severe pain in the head and stomach. They could see big turtles crawling on the beach, but how could they venture to go thither, with hundreds of natives coming and going about their several occupations, with their constant cry of "Tekeli!" Suddenly this crowd of people became violently agitated. Men, women, and children ran wildly about on every side. Some of the savages even took to their boats as though a great danger were at hand. What was happening? William Guy and his companions were very soon informed. The cause of the tumult was the appearance of an unknown animal, a terrible quadruped, which dashed into the midst of the islanders, snapping at and biting them indiscriminately, as it sprang at their throats with a hoarse growling. And yet the infuriated animal was alone, and might easily have been killed by stones or arrows. Why then did a crowd of savages manifest such abject terror? Why did they take to flight? Why did they appear incapable of defending themselves against this one beast? The animal was white, and the sight of it had produced the phenomenon previously observed, that inexplicable terror of whiteness common to all the natives of Tsalal. To their extreme surprise, William Guy and his companions recognized the strange animal as the dog Tiger. Yes, Tiger had escaped from the crumbling mass of the hill and betaken himself to the interior of the island, whence he had returned to Klock Klock to spread terror among the natives. But Tiger was no mere phantom foe, for he was the most dangerous and deadly of enemies, for the poor animal was mad, and his fangs were fatal. This was the reason why the greater part of Tsalal islanders took to flight, headed by their chief Too Wit and the Wampos, who are the leading personages of Klock Klock. It was under these extraordinary circumstances that they abandoned their island, whither they were destined never to return. Although the boats carried off the bulk of the population, a considerable number still remained on Tsalal, having no means of escape, and their fate accomplished itself quickly. Several natives who were bitten by Tiger developed hydrophobia rapidly, and attacked the others. Fearful scenes ensued, and are briefly to be summed up in one dismal statement. The bones we had seen in or near Klock Klock were those of the poor savages which had lain there bleaching for 11 years. The poor dog had died after he had done his fell work, in a corner on the beach, where Dirk Peters found his skeleton and the collar bearing the name of Arthur Pym. Then, after those natives who could not escape from the island had all perished in the manner described, William Guy, Patterson, Trinkle, Coven, Forbes, and Sexton ventured to come out of the labyrinth, where they were on the verge of death by starvation. What sort of existence was that of the 7 survivors of the expedition during the 11 ensuing years? On the whole, it was more endurable than might have been supposed. The natural products of an extremely fertile soil, and the presence of a certain number of domestic animals, secured them against want of food. They had only to make out the best shelter for themselves they could contrive, and wait for an opportunity of getting away from the island with as much patience as might be granted to them. And from whence could such an opportunity come? Only from one of the chances within the resources of Providence. Captain William Guy, Patterson, and their 5 companions descended on the ravine, which was half filled with the fallen masses of the hill face, amid heaps of scoria and blocks of black granite. Before they left this gorge it occurred to William Guy to explore the fissure on the right into which Arthur Pym, Dirk Peters, and Allen had turned, but he found it blocked up. It was impossible for him to get into the pass. Thus he remained in ignorance of the existence of the natural or artificial labyrinth which corresponded with the one he had just left, and probably communicated with it under the dry bed of the torrent. The little company, having passed the chaotic barrier that intercepted the northern route, proceeded rapidly towards the north-west. There, on the coast, at about 3 miles from Klock Klock, they established themselves in a grotto, very like that in our own occupation on the coast of Halbrane Land. And it was in this place that, during long, hopeless years, the 7 survivors of the Jane lived, as we were about to do ourselves, but under better conditions, for the fertility of the soil of Tsalal furnished them with resources unknown in Halbrane Land. In reality, we were condemned to perish when our provisions should be exhausted, but they could have waited indefinitely, and they did wait. They had never entertained any doubt that Arthur Pym, Dirk Peters, and Allen had perished, and this was only too true in Allen's case. How, indeed, could they have ever imagined that Pym and the half-breed had got hold of a boat and made their escape from Tsalal Island? So then, as William Guy told us, not an incident occurred to break the monotony of that existence of 11 years, not even the reappearance of the islanders, who were kept away from Tsalal by superstitious terror. No danger had threatened them during all that time, but of course, as it became more and more prolonged, they lost the hope of ever being rescued. At first, with the return of the fine season, when the sea was once more open, they had thought it possible that a ship would be sent in search of the Jane, but after 4 or 5 years they relinquished all hope. There is no need for dwelling on this period, which extends from the year 1828 to the year 1839. The winters were hard. The summer did indeed extend its beneficent influence to the islands of the Tsalal group, but the cold season, with its attendant snows, rains, and tempests, spared them none of its severity. During 7 months Captain William Guy had not lost one of those who had come with him safe and sound out of the trap set for them at Klock Klock, and this was due, no doubt, to their robust constitutions, remarkable power of endurance, and great strength of character. Alas! misfortune was making ready to fall on them. The month of May had come. It corresponds in those regions to the month of November in northern lands, and the ice packs which the current carried towards the north were beginning to drift past Tsalal. One day one of the 7 men failed to return to the cavern. They called, they waited, they searched for him. All was in vain. He did not reappear. No doubt he had been drowned. He was never more seen by his fellow exiles. This man was Patterson, the faithful companion of William Guy. Now, what William Guy did not know, but we told him, was that Patterson, under what circumstances none would ever learn, had been carried away on the surface of an ice block, where he died of hunger. And on that ice block, which had travelled so far as Prince Edward Island, the boatswain had discovered the corpse of the unfortunate man, almost decomposed by the action of the warmer waters. When Captain Len Guy told his brother of the finding of the body of Patterson, and how it was owing to the notes in his pocket-book that the Halbrane had been enabled to proceed towards the Antarctic seas, William Guy hid his face in his hands and wept. Other misfortunes followed upon this one. 5 months after the disappearance of Patterson, in the middle of October, Tsalal Island was laid waste from coast to coast by an earthquake, which destroyed the south-western group almost entirely. William Guy and his companions must soon have perished on the barren land, which no longer could give them food. had not the means of leaving its coast, now merely an expanse of tumbled rocks, been afforded them in an almost miraculous manner. 2 days after the earthquake, the current carried ashore within a few hundred yards of their cavern a boat which had drifted from the island group on the south west. Without delay of even 1 day, the boat was laden with as much of the remaining provisions as it could contain, and the 6 men embarked in it, bidding adieu for ever to the now uninhabitable island. Unfortunately, a very strong breeze was blowing. It was impossible to resist it, and the boat was driven southward by that very same current which had caused our iceberg to drift to the coast of Halbrane Land. For 2 months and a half these poor fellows were borne across the open sea, with no control over their course. It was not until the 2nd January in the present year, 1840, that they sighted land east of the Jane Sound. Now we already knew this land was not more than 50 miles from Halbrane Land. Yes, so small relatively. An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 25. We Were the First. 2 days later, not one of the survivors from the 2 schooners, the Jane and the Halbrane, remained upon any coast of the Antarctic region. On the 21st of February, at 6 o'clock in the morning, the boat with us all, we numbered 13 in it, left the little creek and doubled the point of Halbrane Land. On the previous day we had fully and finally debated the question of our departure, with the understanding that if it were settled in the affirmative we should start without delay. The captain of the Jane was for an immediate departure, and Captain Len Guy was not opposed to it. I willingly sided with them, and West was of similar opinion. The boatswain was inclined to oppose us. He considered it imprudent to give up a certainty for the uncertain, and he was backed by Endicott, who would in any case say ditto to his Mr. Burke. However, when the time came, Hurliguerly conformed to the view of the majority with a good grace, and declared himself quite ready to set out, since we were all that way of thinking. Our boat was one of those in use in the Tsalal archipelago for plying between the islands. We knew from the narrative of Arthur Pym that these boats were of 2 kinds, one resembling rafts or flat boats, the other strongly built pirogues. Our boat was of the former kind, 4 feet long, 6 feet in width, and worked by several paddles. We called our little craft Parukera, after a fish which abounds in these waters. A rough image of that denizen of the southern deep was cut upon the gunwale. Needless to say that the greater part of the cargo of the Halbrane was left in our cavern, fully protected from weather, at the disposal of any shipwrecked people who might chance to be thrown on the coast of Halbrane Land. The boatswain had planted a spar on the top of this slope to attract attention, but our two schooners notwithstanding, what vessel would ever venture into such latitudes? Nota bene. We were just 13, the fatal number. Perfectly good relations subsisted amongst us. We had no longer to dread the rebellion of a Hearne. How often we had speculated upon the fate of those whom he had beguiled! At 7 o'clock the extreme point of Halbrane Land lay 5 miles behind us, and in the evening we gradually lost sight of the heights that variated that part of the coast. I desired to lay special stress on the fact that not a single scrap of iron entered into the construction of this boat. Not so much as a nail or a bolt, for that metal was entirely unknown to the Tsalal Islanders. The planks were bound together by a sort of liana, or creeping plant, and caulked with moss steeped in pitch, which was turned by contact with the sea water to a substance as hard as metal. I have nothing special to record during the week that succeeded our departure. The breeze blew steadily from the south, and we did not meet with any unfavourable current between the banks of the Jane Sound. During those first 8 days, the Paracuta, by paddling when the wind fell, had kept up the speed that was indispensable for our reaching the Pacific Ocean within a short time. The desolate aspect of the land remained the same, while the strait was already visited by floating drifts, packs of 100 to 200 feet in length, some oblong, others circular, and also by icebergs, which our boat passed easily. We were made anxious, however, by the fact that these masses were proceeding towards the ice barrier, for would they not close the passages which ought to be still open at this time? I shall mention here that in proportion as Dirk Peters was carried further and further from the places wherein no trace of his poor Pym had been found, he was more silent than ever, and no longer even answered me when I addressed him. It must not be forgotten that since our iceberg had passed beyond the South Pole, we were in the zone of eastern longitudes, counted from the zero of Greenwich to the 180th degree. All hope must therefore be abandoned of our either touching at the Falklands, or finding whaling ships in the waters of the Sandwich Islands, the South Orkneys, or South Georgia. Our voyage proceeded under unaltered conditions for 10 days. Our little craft was perfectly seaworthy. The two captains and West fully appreciated its soundness, although, as I have said previously, not a scrap of iron had a place in its construction. It had not once been necessary to repair its seams, so staunch were they. To be sure, the sea was smooth. Its long, rolling waves were hardly ruffled on their surface. On the 10th of March, with the same longitude, the observation gave 7 degrees 13 minutes for latitude. The speed of the Paracuta had then been 30 miles in each 24 hours. If this rate of progress could be maintained for 3 weeks, there was every chance of our finding the passes open, and being able to get round the ice barrier; also that the whaling ships would not yet have left the fishing grounds. The sun was on the verge of the horizon, and the time was approaching when the Antarctic region should be shrouded in polar night. Fortunately, in reascending towards the north, we were getting into waters from whence light was not yet banished. Then did we witness a phenomenon as extraordinary as any of those described by Arthur Pym. For 3 or 4 hours, sparks, accompanied by a sharp noise, shot out of our fingers' ends, our hair, and our beards. There was an electric snowstorm, with great flakes falling loosely, and the contact produced this strange luminosity. The sea rose so suddenly and tumbled about so wildly that the Paracuta was several times in danger of being swallowed up by the waves, but we got through the mystic seeming tempest all safe and sound. Nevertheless, space was thenceforth but imperfectly lighted. Frequent mists came up and bounded our outlook to a few cables' length. Extreme watchfulness and caution were necessary to avoid collision with the floating masses of ice, which were travelling more slowly than the Paracuta. It is also to be noted, on the southern side, the sky was frequently lighted up by the broad and brilliant rays of the polar aurora. The temperature fell very precipitously, and no longer rose above 23 degrees. 48 hours later, Captain Len Guy and his brother succeeded with great difficulty in taking an approximate observation, with the following results of their calculations: latitude 75 degrees 17' south, longitude 118 degrees 13' east. At this date, therefore, 12th March, the Paracuta was distant from the waters of the Antarctic Circle only 400 miles. During the night a thick fog came on, with a subsidence of the breeze. This was to be regretted, for it increased the risk of collision with the floating ice. Of course, fog could not be a surprise to us, being where we were, but what did surprise us was the gradually increasing speed of our boat, although the falling of the wind ought to have lessened it. This increase of speed could not be due to the current, for we were going more quickly than it. This state of things lasted until morning, without our being able to account for what was happening, when at about 10 o'clock the mists began to disappear in the low zones. The coast on the west reappeared, a rocky coast, without a mountainous background. The Paracuta was following its line. And then, no more than a quarter of a mile away, we beheld a huge mound, reared above the plain to a height of 300 feet, with a circumference of from 200 to 300 feet. In its strange form, this great mound resembled an enormous Sphinx, the body upright, the paws stretched out, crouching in the attitude of the winged monster which Grecian mythology has placed upon the way to Thebes. Was this a living animal, a gigantic monster, a mastodon 1,000 times the size of those enormous elephants of the polar seas whose remains are still found in the ice? In our frame of mind we might have believed that it was such a creature, and believed also that the mastodon was about to hurl itself on our little craft and crush it to atoms. After a few moments of unreasoning and unreasonable fright, we recognized that the strange object was only a great mound, singularly shaped, and that the mists had just rolled off its head, leaving it to stand out and confront us. Ah, that Sphinx! I remembered at the sight of it that on the night when the iceberg was overturned and the Halbrane was carried away, I had dreamed of a fabulous animal of this kind, seated at the pole of the world, and from whom Edgar Poe could only wrest its secrets. But our attention was to be attracted, our surprise, even our alarm, was evoked soon by phenomena still more strange than the mysterious earth form upon which the mist curtain had been raised so suddenly. I have said that the speed of the Paracuta was gradually increasing. Now it was excessive, that of the current remaining inferior to it. Now, of a sudden, the grapnel that had belonged to the Halbrane, and was in the bow of the boat, flew out of its socket as though drawn by an irresistible power, and the rope that held it was strained to the breaking point. It seemed to tow us as it grazed the surface of the water towards the shore. "What's the matter?" cried William Guy. "Cut away, boatswain, cut away!" shouted West, "or we shall be dragged against the rocks." Hurliguerly hurried to the bow of the Paracuta to cut away the rope. Of a sudden the knife he held was snatched out of his hand, the rope broke, and the grapnel, like a projectile, shot off in the direction of the Sphinx. At the same moment all the articles on board the boat that were made of iron or steel, cooking utensils, arms, Endicott's stove, our knives, which were torn from out of pockets, took flight after a similar fashion in the same direction, while the boat, quickening its course, brought up against the beach. What was happening? In order to explain these inexplicable things, were we not obliged to acknowledge that we had come into the region of those wonders which I had attributed to the hallucinations of Arthur Pym? No, these were physical facts which we had just witnessed, and not imaginary phenomena. We had, however, no time for reflection, and immediately upon our landing our attention was turned in another direction by the sight of a boat lying wrecked upon the sand. "The Halbrane's boat!" cried Hurliguerly. It was indeed the boat which Hearne had stolen, and it was simply smashed to pieces. In a word, only the formless wreckage of a craft which had been flung against the rocks by the sea remained. We observed immediately that all the ironwork of the boat had disappeared, down to the hinges of the rudder. Not one trace of the metal existed. What could be the meaning of this? A loud call from West brought us to a little strip of beach on the right of our stranded boat. 3 corpses lay upon the stony soil, that of Hearne, that of Martin Holt, and that of one of the Falklands men. Of the 13 who had gone with the sealing master, there remained only these 3, who had evidently been dead some days. What had become of the 10 missing men? Had their bodies been carried out to sea? We searched all along the coast, into the creeks, and between the outlying rocks, but in vain. Nothing was to be found. No traces of a camp, not even the vestiges of a landing. "Their boat," said William Guy, "must have been struck by a drifting iceberg. The rest of Hearne's companions have been drowned, and only these 3 bodies have come ashore lifeless." "But," asked the boatswain, "how is the state the boat is in to be explained?" "And especially," added West, "the disappearance of all the iron." "Indeed," said I, "it looks as though every bit had been violently torn off." Leaving the Paracuta in the charge of 2 men, we again took our way to the interior, in order to extend our search over a wider expanse. As we were approaching the huge mound, the mist cleared away, and the form stood out with greater distinctness. It was, as I have said, almost that of a sphinx, a dusky hued sphinx, as though the matter which composed it had been oxidized by the inclemency of the polar climate. And then a possibility flashed into my mind, an hypothesis which explained these astonishing phenomena. "Ah!" I exclaimed, "a lodestone! That is it! A magnet with prodigious power of attraction!" I was understood, and in an instant the final catastrophe to which Hearne and his companions were victims was explained with terrible clearness. The Antarctic Sphinx was simply a colossal magnet. Under the influence of that magnet, the iron bands of the Halbrane's boat had been torn out and projected as though by the action of a catapult. This was the occult force that had irresistibly attracted everything made of iron on the Paracuta, and the boat itself would have shared the fate of the Halbrane's boat had a single bit of metal been employed in its construction. Was it, then, the proximity of the magnetic pole that produced such effects? At first we entertained this idea, but on reflection we rejected it. At the place where the magnetic meridians cross, The only phenomenon produced is the vertical position of the magnetic needle in two similar points of the terrestrial globe. This phenomenon, already proved by observations made on the spot, must be identical in the Antarctic regions. Thus, then, there did exist a magnet of prodigious intensity in the zone of attraction which we had entered. Under our eyes one of those surprising effects which had hitherto been classed among fables was actually produced. The following appeared to me to be the true explanation. The trade winds bring a constant succession of clouds or mists in which immense quantities of electricity, not completely exhausted by storms, are stored. Hence there exists a formidable accumulation of electric fluid at the poles, and it flows towards the land in a permanent stream. From this cause come the northern and southern auroras, whose luminous splendours shine above the horizon, especially during the long polar night, and are visible even in the temperate zones when they attain their maximum of culmination. These continuous currents at the poles, which bewilder our compasses, might possess an extraordinary influence, and it would suffice that a block of iron should be subjected to their action for it could be changed into a magnet of power proportioned to the intensity of the current, to the number of turns of the electric helix, and to the square root of the diameter of the block of magnetized iron. Thus, then, the bulk of the Sphinx, which upreared its mystic form upon this outer edge of the southern lands, might be calculated by thousands of cubic yards. Now, in order that the current should circulate around it, and make a magnet of it by induction, what was required? Nothing but a metallic lode, whose innumerable windings through the bowels of the soil should be connected subterraneously at the base of the block. It seemed to me that the place of this block ought to be in the magnetic axis, as a sort of gigantic calamite, from whence the imponderable fluid, whose currents made an inexhaustible accumulator set up at the confines of the world, should issue. Our compass could not have enabled us to determine whether the marvel before our eyes really was at the magnetic pole of the southern regions. All I can say is, that the needle staggered about, helpless and useless, and in fact the exact location of the Antarctic Sphinx mattered little in respect of the constitution of that artificial lodestone, and the manner in which the clouds and metallic lode supplied its attractive power. In this very plausible fashion I was led to explain the phenomenon by instinct. It could not be doubted that we were in the vicinity of a magnet which produced these terrible but strictly natural effects by its attraction. I communicated my ideas to my companions, and they regarded this explanation as conclusive, in presence of the physical facts of which we were the actual witnesses. "We shall incur no risk by going to the foot of the mound, I suppose?" said Captain Len Guy. "None," I replied. "There, yes, here." I could not describe the impression those three words made upon us. Edgar Poe would have said that they were three cries from the depths of the underworld. It was Dirk Peters who had spoken, and his body was stretched out in the direction of the Sphinx, as though it had been turned to iron and was attracted by the magnet. Then he sped swiftly towards the Sphinx-like mound, and his companions followed him over rough ground strewn with volcanic remains of all sorts. The monster grew larger as we neared it, but lost none of its mythological shape. Alone on that vast plain it produced a sense of awe, and, but this could only have been a delusion, we seemed to be drawn towards it by the force of its magnetic attraction. On arriving at the base of the mound, we found there the various articles on which the magnet had exerted its powers. Arms, utensils, the grapnel of the paracuta, all adhering to the sides of the monster. There were also the iron relics of the Halbrane's boat, all her utensils, arms, and fittings, even to the nails and the iron portions of the rudder. There was no possibility of regaining possession of any of these things. Even had they not adhered to the lodestone rock at too great a height to be reached, they adhered to it too closely to be detached. Hurliguerly was infuriated by the impossibility of recovering his knife, which he recognized at 50 feet above his head, and cried as he shook his clenched fist at the imperturbable monster, "Thief of a Sphinx!" Of course, the things which had belonged to the Halbrane's boat and the Paracuta's were the only articles that adorned the mighty sides of the lonely mystic form. Never had any ship reached such a latitude of the Antarctic Sea. Hearne and his accomplices, Captain Len Guy and his companions, were the first who had trodden this point of the southern continent, and any vessel that might have approached this colossal magnet must have incurred certain destruction. Our schooner must have perished, even as its boat had been dashed into An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 26. A Little Remnant. That same day, in the afternoon, the Paracuta departed from the coast of the land of the Sphinx, which had lain to the west of us since the 21st of February. By the death of Dirk Peters, the number of the passengers was reduced to 12. These were all who remained of the double crew of the two schooners, the first comprising 38 men, the second 32, in all 70 souls. But let it not be forgotten that the voyage of the Halbrane had been undertaken in fulfilment of a duty to humanity, and 4 of the survivors of the Jane owed their rescue to it. And now there remains but little to tell, and what must be related as succinctly as possible. It is unnecessary to dwell upon our return voyage, which was favoured by the constancy of the currents and the wind to the northern course. The last part of the voyage was accomplished amid great fatigue and suffering, but it ended in our safe deliverance from all these. Firstly, a few days after our departure from the land of the Sphinx, the sun set behind the western horizon to reappear no more for the whole winter. It was then the midst of the semi-darkness of the austral night that the Paracuta pursued her monotonous course. True, the southern polar lights were frequently visible, but they were not the sun, that single orb of day which had illumined our horizons during the months of the Antarctic summer, and their capricious splendour could not replace his unchanging light. That long darkness of the poles sheds a moral and physical influence on mortals which no one can elude, a gloomy and overwhelming impression almost impossible to resist. Of all of the Paracuta's passengers, the boatswain and Endicott only preserved their habitual good humour. Those two were equally insensible to the weariness and the peril of a voyage. I also except West, who was ever ready to face every eventuality, like a man who is always on the defensive. As for the two brothers Guy, their happiness in being restored to each other made them frequently oblivious to the anxieties and risks of the future. Of Hurliguerly I cannot speak too highly. He proved himself a thoroughly good fellow, and it raised our drooping spirits to hear him repeat in his jolly voice: "We shall get to port all right, my friends, be sure of that, and if you can only reckon things up, you will see that we have had more good luck than bad. Oh yes, I know there was the loss of our schooner, poor Halbrane, carried up into the air like a balloon, then flung into the deep like an avalanche. But, on the other hand, there was the iceberg, which brought us to the coast, and the Tsalal boat, which brought us and Captain William Guy and his 3 companions together. And don't forget the current and the breeze that has pushed us on up to now, and will keep pushing us on, I am sure of that. With so many trumps in our hand, we cannot possibly lose the game. The only thing to be regretted is that we shall have to get ashore again in Australia or New Zealand, instead of casting anchor at the Kerguelens, near the quay of Christmas Harbour, in front of the Green Cormorant." For a week we pursued our course without deviation to east or west, and it was not until the 21st of March that the Paracutas lost sight of Halbrane Land, being carried towards the north by the current, while the coastline of the continent, for such we are convinced it is, trended in a round curve to the northeast. Although the waters of this portion of the sea were still open, they carried a flotilla of icebergs or ice fields. Hence arose serious difficulties, and also dangers to navigation in the midst of the gloomy mists, when we had to manoeuvre between these moving masses, either to find passage or to prevent our little craft from being crushed like grain between the millstones. Besides, Captain Len Guy could no longer ascertain his position either in latitude or longitude, the sun being absent. Calculations by the positions of the stars were too complicated. It was impossible to take altitudes, and the Paracuta abandoned herself to the action of the current, which invariably bore us northward, as the compass indicated. By keeping the reckoning of its medium speed, however, we concluded that on the 27th of March our boat was between the 69th and the 68th parallels, that is to say, some 70 miles only from the Antarctic Circle. Ah, if no obstacle to the course of our perilous navigation had existed, if passage between this inner sea of the southern zone and the waters of the Pacific Ocean had been certain, the Paracuta might have reached the extreme limit of the austral seas in a few days. But a few hundred miles more to sail, and the iceberg barrier would confront us with its immovable rampart, and unless a passage could be found, we should be obliged to go round it, either by the east or by the west. Once cleared, indeed! Ah! once cleared, we should be in a frail craft upon the terrible Pacific Ocean, at the period of the year when its tempests rage with redoubled fury, and strong ships dread the might of its waves. We were determined not to think of this. Heaven would come to our aid. We should be picked up by some ship. This the boatswain asserted confidently, and we were bound to believe the boatswain. For 6 entire days, until the end of April, the Paracuta held her course among the ice barrier, whose crest was profiled at an altitude of between 700 and 800 feet above the level of the sea. The extremities were not visible either on the east or the west, and if our boat did not find an open passage, we could not clear it. By a most fortunate chance a passage was found on the above mentioned date, and attempted, amid 1,000 risks. Yes, we required all the zeal, skill, and courage of our men and their chiefs to accomplish such a task. At last we were in the South Pacific waters, but our boat had suffered severely in getting through, and it had sprung more than one leak. We were kept busy in bailing out the water, which also came in from above. The breeze was gentle, the sea more calm than we could have hoped, and the real danger did not lie in the risks of navigation. No, it arose from the fact that not a ship was visible in these waters. Not a whaler was to be seen on the fishing grounds. At the beginning of April these places are forsaken, and we arrived some weeks too late. We learned afterwards that had we arrived a little sooner, we should have met the vessels of the American expedition. In fact, on the 1st of February, by 95° 50' longitude and 64° 17' latitude, Lieutenant Wilkes was still exploring these seas in one of his ships, the Vincennes, after having discovered a long extent of coast stretching from east to west. On the approach of the bad season he returned to Hobart Town in Tasmania. This same year the expedition of the French Captain Dumont d'Urville, which started in 1838, discovered Adélie Land in 66° 30' latitude and 38° 21' east longitude, and Clare Coast in 64° 30' and 129° 54'. Their campaign having ended with these important discoveries, the Astrolabe and the Zélé left the Antarctic Ocean and returned to Hobart Town. None of these ships then were in those waters, so that when our nutshell Paracuta was alone on a lone sea, beyond the ice barrier, we were bound to believe that it was no longer possible we could be saved. We were 1,500 miles away from the nearest land, and winter was a month old. Hurliguerly himself was obliged to acknowledge the last fortunate chance upon which he had counted failed us. On the 16th of April we were at the end of our resources. The sea began to threaten. The boat seemed likely to be swallowed up in the angry waves. "A ship!" cried the boatswain, and on the instant we made out a vessel about 4 miles to the northeast, beneath the mist which had suddenly risen. Signals were made, signals were perceived. The ship lowered her largest boat and sent it to our rescue. The ship was the Tasman, an American 3-master, from Charlestown, where we were received with eager welcome and cordiality. The captain treated my companions as though they had been his own countrymen. The Tasman had come from the Falkland Islands, where the captain had learned that 7 months previous the American schooner Halbrane had gone to the southern seas in search of the shipwrecked people of the Jane, but as the season advanced The schooner not having reappeared, she was given up for lost in the Antarctic regions. 15 days after our rescue, the Tasman disembarked the survivors of the crew of the two schooners at Melbourne, and it was there that our men were paid the sums they had so hardly earned, and so well deserved.